Blood. That was my first thought when I saw the deep red splattered all over the floor. But it wasn't blood. It was cherry blossom petals falling like rain while chainsaws were tearing apart the branches of the centuries-old tree in my backyard. Hey, stop that right now! I dropped my groceries on the garage floor and ran through the side garden. 3 uniformed guys, all sporting the Harrison Solutions logo, paused their work for a moment. The tallest of them, clearly the supervisor, took off his ear protection. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, with that bored look like he deals with angry homeowners all the time. "What the hell do you think you're doing to my cherry tree? We got orders to remove that tree. It's all documented." He handed me a clipboard with a stamped form. "I didn't authorize any of this. This tree is over 100 years old." While we were arguing, a deafening crack echoed above us. One of the biggest branches snapped and fell heavily toward the fence separating my yard from the neighbors. The crash was followed by the sound of shattering glass and water gushing everywhere. "My water garden!" Susan Wilson's shrill cry pierced the air as she bolted out of her house. "Look at what you did!" Her Japanese garden, with the little ornamental pond she proudly showed off at every condo meeting, was ruined. Designer stones and koi fish were scattered over the lawn among shards of glass and splintered wood. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this. "This is your responsibility," declared Susan, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "It's going to cost me at least 28 grand to fix everything." My responsibility? I didn't even know they were cutting down the tree. I never authorized that. A black SUV pulled up in front of my house, and out stepped William Harrison, the president of our homeowners association. With his immaculate suit and that all-business smile, he walked up to us like he was leading a board meeting. "I got your emergency call, Susan," he said smoothly, before turning to me. "We've got a problem here that needs to be sorted out." "The problem is you cut down my tree without my permission," I replied. William crossed his arms. "The tree was in violation of the Lakeside Gardens Aesthetic Code. The board voted for its removal after Susan filed a formal complaint. We sent 3 notices. I never got any notice, and besides, this tree is completely on my property." William exchanged a glance with Susan that made me feel like a naive kid in a game I didn't even understand. "The association's rules are clear," he continued. "When you bought this house, you signed an agreement agreeing to our decisions. And as for Susan's water garden, the restoration costs are on you. She'll present the estimates tomorrow. I'm not paying for something I didn't authorize." William smiled, that smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That attitude will only complicate things. I suggest you reconsider." That night, as I stared out the window at the mutilated remains of the cherry tree, I heard soft knocking at the front door. It was George Miller, my 72-year-old neighbor who lived 3 houses down on the same street. "I came to see how you were holding up," he said, holding a yellow folder. "I saw what they did to your tree." George had lived in Lakeside Gardens since the condo was founded. I invited him in, and we served coffee at the kitchen table. "They had no right to do that," he stated, opening the folder. "I studied the original plans of the subdivision. Your property has a quirk that the other lots don't. Your lot was set aside with special rights to native vegetation when the condo was developed." He spread old maps and documents across the table. "See this line? Your cherry tree was completely within the protected area. Then why would Harrison do something like that? William's been running this association for 5 years. Since then, the fees have gone up 300%, and all the maintenance contracts have gone to companies tied to him. I've been watching, but nobody wants to listen to an old man complaining." The next day, I scheduled a meeting with Jennifer Taylor, a lawyer specializing in real estate disputes. I brought all the documents George had given me. "They violated several state laws," Jennifer explained after looking over the papers. "Without your written permission, the HOA had no right to touch that tree, especially given its protected status. And as for the compensation they're demanding, it's completely out of line." 3 days later, I found a fine notice on my door. $28,000 for damages to neighboring property and aesthetic devaluation of the complex. The document had William's digital signature and the association's official seal. Jennifer sent a formal notice contesting both the tree removal and the fine. The response came quickly and unexpectedly. After getting home from work, I found my car with flat tires and a message on the windshield: "Follow the rules or get out." On the condo's WhatsApp group, Susan shared photos of her ruined garden with the caption, "Result of negligence and refusal to maintain properties properly. Some neighbors are a danger to our community." My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew who she was referring to. Comments multiplied, most of them condemning me without even hearing my side. A few neighbors who used to greet me now averted their eyes. One morning when I opened my mailbox, I found flyers warning of soil contamination risks on my property. That same day, I received emails from brokers offering to buy my house, despite its known issues, at a reduced but fair price. With Jennifer, we filed a formal complaint at the police station about the vandalism and threats. Detective Sarah Johnson attended to me with a seriousness I hadn't expected. "Your name has come up on our radar recently," she said while checking her computer. "Not as a suspect, but as a potential victim." She closed the meeting room door and lowered her voice. "I shouldn't share this, but William Harrison has been under investigation for months. It started as a case of tax evasion, but we've uncovered links to cyber fraud and money laundering." "Because of the association contracts?" I asked, recalling George's suspicions. "It's much bigger than that," the detective replied. "Harrison is building a network of data centers hidden in residential areas. He's exploiting his access to properties through the associations he controls." "What does that have to do with my tree?" "Your property is strategically located. It's the highest point in the community, with direct access to the main fiber network and the lake's cooling system. Perfect for the kind of drilling equipment he needs to install." My stomach sank. "So they want my house. And they'll do whatever it takes to either force you to sell it cheap or kick you out," Sarah confirmed. "The FBI is involved now. The agent in charge wants to speak with you." Agent Amanda Carter met me at the local FBI office in a discreet room, away from prying eyes. Her first words caught me off guard. "We discovered that William Harrison isn't just a corrupt businessman, but is also running a sophisticated cybercrime network disguised behind ordinary properties," she explained, as she opened a folder with photos and documents. "This operation is valuable enough that he'll go to almost any lengths to get your property." "Including taking down a centuries-old tree?" I asked. That was just the beginning. The agent slid a photo across the table. It showed a surveillance capture of William and David Wilson, Susan's husband, talking in the back of a restaurant. David works on the Urban Planning Commission. He's the one who approves William's projects without asking any questions about those peculiar technical requirements or the unusually high energy use. Another photo showed 3 men entering my backyard in the middle of the night, carrying equipment. I recognized one of them as the guy who cut down my tree. "This was 3 nights ago. They were spreading contaminants in your soil, radioactive material in low doses, enough to set off detectors but not enough to actually harm anyone's health." My heart pounded. "Are they poisoning my garden?" "To force you out through environmental regulations. The next phase would be to discover that contamination during a surprise inspection, and then order an immediate evacuation." She paused. "All of this so Harrison can install one of his main server nodes for cyber attacks and electronic fraud." In the following hours, Amanda revealed the extent of the operation. William Harrison had built what looked like a legitimate career in technology and construction, but behind the official businesses, he ran a sophisticated network of servers used to steal data, attack financial systems, and even manipulate cryptocurrencies. The profits were laundered through the inflated maintenance contracts of the associations he controlled. "Why don't they just arrest him already?" I asked. "We need to catch the whole network, not just Harrison. We have enough evidence on the financial crimes, but we want to expose the entire physical infrastructure," Amanda explained. "And for that, we need your cooperation." The FBI's proposal was simple, but terrifying. I would keep acting as usual, protesting against the HOA and refusing to pay the fine, while they monitored every move made by Harrison and his associates. I agreed, even knowing that it would mean facing even more hostility from the neighborhood. The next morning, I found George waiting at my door with a worried look. "I need to show you something," he said, leading me to his car. We drove for about 10 minutes until we reached another complex run by William. "Check out that house on the corner." It looked like a normal property at first glance, but something was off. The air conditioner was noticeably bigger than those in the surrounding homes, and there was a discrete generator in the yard. The original owner was practically forced out 2 years ago. Same tactic. Problems with the HOA, absurd fines, baseless claims of violations that nobody could clearly explain, George explained. After Harrison bought the property through a shell company, they installed all that extra equipment. The energy consumption in that house is 5 times higher than any other in the neighborhood. How did you figure that out? I worked as an electrical engineer for 40 years. Some things don't go unnoticed when you know what to look for. George parked a little further. There's more. I looked into the public records of all the properties Harrison acquired over the past few years. They all follow the same pattern, located near power substations or fiber optic hubs, always with that same intimidation tactic to force a sale. Back at my place, I found Jennifer in her car waiting for me. She was carrying a folder with legal documents and a determined look. "I got a temporary injunction stopping the HOA from charging the fine," she announced. "But there's something even more disturbing. I found records of a company called Quantum Data Solutions trying to request permissions for underground installations on your specific property. The application was filed 3 months ago, even before they cut your tree. Who owns that company?" "Officially, a guy named Richard Simmons, but I traced it back to one of William's companies through tax documents. They were already planning to take your property long before Susan complained about the tree. An anonymous email arrived while we were talking. It contained a soil analysis report supposedly carried out during a routine inspection that never happened, showing alarming levels of radioactive residuals exactly where my cherry tree used to be. Attached was an unofficial warning that the matter would be discussed at the next HOA meeting. "They're speeding up the plan," I commented, showing the email to Jennifer. "This is environmental evidence tampering. Something very serious," she replied, while photographing the documents on her phone. "I'm sending this on to Agent Carter immediately." The next morning, Susan Wilson showed up at my door accompanied by a public health official. Or at least, that's how she introduced him. "This is Dr. Peterson, an expert on environmental contamination," she said with feigned concern. "We're here to check the radiation levels reported on your property." The man, wearing a white lab coat and carrying measurement equipment, looked nervous. When I asked to see his credentials, he hesitated before showing a badge that clearly had been printed recently. "Shall we start at the spot where the tree used to be?" he asked, avoiding my gaze. "Sure," I replied, pretending to cooperate as per the FBI's instructions. "But I'd like to record the entire process if you don't mind, just for my own safety." Susan visibly paled. "That's not necessary. It's just a standard inspection." "Even so, I insist," I shot back, holding up my phone. "Given everything that's happened recently, I want to document every interaction." After exchanging looks with Susan, the supposed expert started taking measurements with his detector. Unsurprisingly, the levels spiked as he got close to where the cherry tree had once stood. The device started beeping loudly. "This is very concerning," he declared with a fake seriousness. "The levels are way above what's acceptable for human habitation. We'll have to recommend immediate evacuation." "Interesting," I said calmly, "especially since I installed security cameras after the vandalism on my car, and I have clear recordings showing 3 men dumping something into my garden a few nights ago." The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday night at the Lakeside Gardens Community Center. The auditorium was more packed than ever. Apparently, news of dangerous contamination had spread fast. I could feel suspicious and even fearful looks from some neighbors as I walked in. On the makeshift stage, William Harrison and 5 board members sat behind a long table. Susan Wilson occupied a place of honor among them, dressed formally as if she were in a courtroom. Her husband David sat in the front row, incessantly texting on his phone. "Good evening, everyone," William began, his voice controlled and professional. "We have called this emergency meeting to discuss a serious situation affecting the safety of our community." As he spoke, I noticed George sitting quietly at the back, and Jennifer was by my side, ready to defend me legally. Following FBI instructions, I had tucked a small recording device under my shirt. William continued. "Recently, we discovered alarming evidence of radioactive contamination on one of the properties in Lakeside Gardens." A murmur went through the room. "Before panic spreads, I want to assure you we're taking all necessary measures to contain the issue." A slide presentation started, showing complex charts and an aerial photo of my house with areas marked in red. Dr. Peterson, our environmental contamination specialist, is here to explain the implications. The same man who had visited my house now stood, dressed in a suit instead of a lab coat. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, using complicated technical jargon to basically say that my property represented a catastrophic risk, and that the only solution was to completely remove the contaminated soil, a process that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and require demolishing the house. Susan then took the microphone. "As you all know, we have strict rules regarding property maintenance and community safety. The association statute is clear. Any property posing a proven risk to public health may be subject to emergency intervention." William resumed control of the presentation. "Therefore, we propose an immediate vote on 2 matters. First, to authorize the HOA to hire specialists for remediation, with the costs passed on to the owner. Second, if there's resistance, to initiate the foreclosure process for serious regulation violations." Jennifer squeezed my arm, signaling that it was my turn to speak up. I stood up and walked to the center aisle. "I'd like to exercise my right to respond before the vote," I said loudly. William looked irritated by the interruption but nodded. 5 minutes. Neighbors, I began, looking directly at the audience. Everything you heard today is a complete fabrication. There is no radioactive contamination on my property. What we actually have is a criminal scheme led by our HOA president. Shock and outrage erupted from all around. William banged his gavel on the table. That's defamation. I must ask you to stand down. I have proof, I continued, ignoring him. Security cameras captured Harrison Solutions employees dumping substances in my garden 3 days before the so-called contamination was discovered. Jennifer stood up and played the video we had prepared. The black and white footage clearly showed 3 guys spreading something exactly where the cherry tree had been removed. Furthermore, I added as the video played, the lab that supposedly analyzed the soil samples doesn't exist. The company Environmental Safety Analytics was registered just 2 weeks ago, at the same address as William's secondary construction firm. The room burst into agitated conversations. Susan stood up, visibly disturbed. This is ridiculous. Why would we ever do something like this? Because you all want my property at any cost, I replied. And I'm not the first one. In the last 3 years, 7 homeowners were forced to sell their houses to shell companies controlled by William Harrison, always after systematic campaigns of harassment and intimidation. George got up from the back. I can confirm that. I compiled records of all those transactions, and the pattern is undeniable. William tried to regain control, but his face turned red with anger. This is a ridiculous conspiracy. We're here to protect the community. The truth, I continued, is that these properties are being used to house equipment for illegal servers. William isn't interested in our safety. He's interested in expanding his cybercrime network, using our community as a front. David Wilson abruptly got up and hurriedly headed for the exit. Before he could get out, 2 men in suits discreetly blocked his path. William Harrison, announced a firm voice from the main entrance. Agent Amanda Carter walked into the center aisle, followed by 6 formally dressed FBI agents. We are here with a warrant for your arrest on multiple federal charges, including electronic fraud, extortion, falsifying environmental records, and running a cybercrime network. A tangible silence fell over the room. William looked like he'd seen a ghost, his face changing from red to a sickly white in seconds. This must be some mistake, he stammered, trying to keep composed. I don't know what you're talking about. We have search warrants for your properties, including the 7 fraudulently acquired homes in this complex that house your illegal server infrastructure, explained Amanda, as an agent handed William official documents. And for the residences of Susan and David Wilson, on charges of complicity in falsifying public records and obstructing justice. Susan let out a muffled cry, looking around frantically as if searching for an escape route. David didn't know anything. He just signed the documents William asked him to. Neighbors began standing up, some edging closer to listen, others backing away as if fearing entanglement. Jennifer stayed by my side, discreetly documenting everything. One FBI agent stepped onto the stage and began reading William's rights, as another did the same with Susan. David was already being escorted out of the auditorium, head down, without resistance. This is the result of an 18-month investigation, Amanda explained, now addressing the stunned community. William Harrison used his position as HOA president to acquire strategically located properties where he installed server equipment for illegal operations. We're talking about bank fraud, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, and manipulation of financial markets. As she spoke, more agents moved through the room, cordoning off sections and collecting laptops and electronic devices that the board members had hastily left behind in their attempt to scramble out. The HOA funds were systematically diverted to shell companies, Amanda continued. It's estimated that over $5 million in fees paid by you all were used to finance this criminal operation. A murmur of indignation spread through the room. Years of constant increases in condo fees, supposedly for improvements that never fully materialized, suddenly made sense to everyone. And what about the contamination? Are we in danger? Asked an elderly lady in the front row, visibly shaken. There is no radioactive contamination, Amanda stated flatly. Our teams already analyzed the soil from the property in question and confirmed that the substances deposited were chemical compounds designed to mimic radioactive readings on common detectors, but they pose no real danger to health. As William was led away, he paused briefly by my side. His eyes, once confident and calculating, now overflowed with impotent rage. You have no idea what you've just done, he muttered. This goes beyond me. Amanda, close enough to hear, motioned for the agents to take him away quickly. Don't worry, she said to me. He's just trying to appear more important than he really is. Typical of white-collar crooks when they get caught. In the following minutes, the community center turned into a mix of an investigation hall and a collective therapy session. Neighbors who barely talked before now shared their stories of intimidation by the HOA. Some recalled inexplicable fines, while others spoke of pressure to sell certain properties. With each new account, a dark pattern of abuse of power emerged. George came up to me with a tired smile. I always knew something was off, but I never imagined it was this big. Jennifer squeezed my hand. You took on an entire system and won. Not everyone would have had that courage. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this. 3 weeks after the FBI intervention, Lakeside Gardens was beginning to find a sense of normalcy, albeit a transformed one after the crimes that had happened right under our noses. A General Assembly was called to elect a new board for the Homeowners Association, and for the first time in years, there were more candidates than available positions. The meeting room was decorated with flowers, a symbolic gesture spontaneously organized by the residents. In the center of the main arrangement, a small cherry bud in an ornamental pot stood out. I found this sprout growing from the roots of your old tree, explained Maria Gonzalez, a neighbor I barely knew before all this. I thought it should be preserved. The meeting began with a minute of silence, not for those involved in the scheme, but for all the time the community had spent living under threat and manipulation. Then, Agent Amanda Carter was invited to give an update on the investigation. William Harrison, Susan Wilson, and David Wilson remain in custody, with their bail requests denied due to the severity of their crimes and flight risk, she stated. The charges include extortion, electronic fraud, document forgery, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit cybercrimes. She paused before continuing. The operation was more extensive than we initially thought. Harrison was running similar server setups in 5 different communities across 3 states. The seized equipment was connected to at least a dozen major cyber attacks in the past 2 years, including the regional bank data breach and the temporary shutdown of the state's electrical grid last July. The neighbors exchanged stunned glances. The scope of the crimes made our previous squabbles over fences, house colors, and gardening regulations look trivial by comparison. And what about the association's finances? Amanda continued. A forensic audit determined that approximately 65% of all fees collected over the past 5 years were siphoned off to companies linked to Harrison. The Department of Justice is working to recover those funds, and there's a possibility of partial restitution to the residents. After the update, the election for the new board took place. To my surprise, my name was included on the list of candidates, even though I hadn't put myself forward. When I asked about it, Jorge raised his hand with an embarrassed smile. We need people who have the courage to question what seems wrong, he explained. You showed that when most of us were too scared to speak up. The vote was unanimous. Along with me, George and 3 other residents who had questioned William's practices over the years formed the new board. Our first official resolution was to completely rewrite the association's statute, including clauses for transparency and limitations on power. 2 weeks later, while organizing documents at the new board office, Jennifer visited me with a folder containing the preliminary case ruling. William is looking at least 20 years, she said. Susan got a cooperation deal, but she's still facing at least 5 years. David will likely serve his sentence in a semi-open regime for having cooperated more extensively. And what about the properties used for the servers? They'll be returned to the original owners who were forced to sell, with compensation for their lost years, she explained. If that's not possible in some cases, they'll be sold, and the money will go into a reparation fund for all the victims. At the end of that afternoon, I walked to where my centuries-old cherry tree had stood. The stump was still there, marking decades of growth abruptly halted. But all around, small green shoots were emerging from the soil, descendants of the original tree that just refused to completely disappear. A family car pulled up nearby, and George got out slowly, leaning on his cane. He carried a small cherry seedling in an ornamental pot. I thought we could plant this together, he suggested. It's a direct descendant of your original tree. I grew it from seeds I collected years ago, back when I still had a bit of pep to walk around the neighborhood. While we dug in the soil together to plant the new tree, other neighbors began to gather, some bringing gardening tools, others simply offering their help. In a matter of minutes, a circle formed around the little seedling. Most of the people I barely knew before these events. I propose that this becomes our new tradition, suggested an elderly lady from across the complex. Plant a tree for every year we've spent being deceived, until Lakeside Gardens is fully green again. When we finished planting, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the tiny sprout that symbolized so much more than just a tree. It represented a rediscovered community, the courage to question abusive authority, and the possibility of rebuilding even after devastation. That night, sitting on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the new cherry protected by a small decorative fence installed by volunteer neighbors, I reflected on how it all began with a tree being cut down without permission. What William Harrison never understood was that by trying to remove a supposed obstacle to his criminal plans, he ended up exposing much deeper roots, the roots of a community that, once awakened, proved stronger than any corrupt scheme. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this.